finance, a la shmup. How are interest rates determined? Alright, so imagine this. Some nice stranger out there just pre-approved you for a credit card. Groovy. Looking over the paperwork you got in the mail, however, it appears there's a 20% interest rate attached. Awesome-ish. Except you have no idea what an interest rate is, why it's that percentage, or who set it at 20%. Well, congratulations, you're about as clueless as the typical 35-year-old these days, but here's the lowdown. For every $1,000 you borrow on that credit card, you'll be paying $200 a year to rent that money. And you'll continue to pay that every year until both the principal and the interest of your loan are paid off. Well, there are two elements to an interest rate. One element is the economy. The world's interest rates are generally set by governments seeking to either add fuel to the flame of the economy by lowering rates and making money cheap to borrow so people spend and hire people, or they're trying to suck oxygen from its thirsty, gaping maw so that the world's economies are relatively stable and inflation is under control, meaning they make the cost of borrowing money high so the pricing doesn't get out of control. And that's for a different video, and we'll get to that later. All right, well, when economies are weak, the government lowers interest rates, right? They're hoping to encourage people to spend money, greenlight new projects, hire new bodies, do stuff with their dough. Low interest rates on credit cards are generally a good thing for consumers seeking to buy tchotchkes, like earrings and belly rings at a mall. So, that is, if your credit card only charged you 2% a year in interest, well, that'd be $20 a year to rent that grand. And with cheap money available to you, well, you'd be happy to buy more belly rings on credit. Well, things work in the opposite direction as well. When economies get too hot and inflation runs out of control, governments seek to cool things down by raising the cost of money. When inflation is very high, bad things happen generally to old people, which sucks because we love those guys. They always have butterscotch candy. Take, for example, someone who lives on a pension that pays them, say, 3% a year, like it's all in bonds because they have to be safe. They can't take stock market risks, so they only get 3%. Well, if inflation skyrockets and it's 10% a year, well, in a very short time period, their spending dollar buys only half as much as it used to, and, well, then you can find these people living in a station wagon from the 70s parked on your local curb. Got it? So if inflation's 10%, they're only getting 3%. They're losing 7% of their buying power every year. So that was the capital markets price of money, i.e., what's the price the government sets for the cost of its best customers to borrow money? Yeah, that's the Fed. That's kind of how they price lending money to banks. All right, well, who are the best customers? Google, Bill Gates, that nun who just won the lottery. But that doesn't tell the whole interest rate story here. Why would you be charged 20% interest on your credit card and Bill Gates only 3%? One word, risk. If you're Bill Gates, who's got like roughly $1 bajillion, and you're taking a loan for a short duration and have a long history of paying back your debt, well, you're a low risk to pay back that $1,000 Bill borrowed to put his belly button ring in at the mall, and a bank can afford to charge him a small interest rate because it's so likely they'll get paid back. Whereas if you're just some bum named Gil Yates, no relation, obviously, and you have $5 to your name and are a huge flight risk, well, a bank is probably not going to be too excited to offer you any loan at all. And if they did, it would feature an extremely high interest rate to make up for the risk of you not paying them back. Right? If you were the bank, you'd probably do the same thing. So who's the magic wizard behind the curtain who sets these things in the first place, and how does that work? Well, financially, the U.S. is still the center of the world. The Fed is the American vehicle which sets the price to banks for borrowing money. The Fed. The Fed. Yeah, it sounds kind of like Big Shot there, right? Well, structurally, banks might pay 1% to the government to borrow money, and then they might mark up the price of that money to 5%, making a 4% spread between the bid and the ask price of the debt that they basically buy from the government and then resell to people like you and me. In English, you bet. Say a bank takes $1 million loan from the Fed, it'll pay $10,000 a year in interest to the Fed for borrowing that money. If it turns around and loans money money to Joe the Plumber, $1 million for his parts distribution business, charging him 5% per year. Well, then Joe pays the bank $50,000 a year to rent that money, and the bank shows a gross profit there of $40,000 a year just for kindly Joe. That's 50 minus 10. Yeah, some heavy calculus there. Now, while all of this might sound like the financial gravy train, it's not that simple. Joe the Plumber's business, that kind of business, goes bankrupt all the time. And when that happens, banks don't get paid back the $1 million they loaned Joe. Sometimes they get zero. The banks are, however, still on the hook for the $1 million they borrowed from the American federal system. If the bank doesn't pay back the Fed, well, they basically all go to jail and get tortured in Guantanamo or something like that. Oh wait, we don't torture anymore, do we? Oh, we do? All right, then you don't want to default on the Fed. So anyway, that wide spread of 4% has to cover a lot of deadbeats who don't follow through on their promises to pay back the money they borrow. And that's how it works in the U.S., and most Western countries have more or less the same system. The numbers may seem small to you, but over time, they really add up. If you borrow $10,000 at a 20% annual rate, and it takes you 10 years to pay off that money, well, your total interest would be, and strap yourself in there, here's the math, it's 10,000 times the quantity 1 plus 0.2, which is the 20% there, to the 10th power. That's how you do the math there. So what's 1.2 to the 10th, which reflects the compounding of that interest rate for about 10 years? Well, it's about 6.2. How do you get the math? Well, you multiply that number by 10,000, which reveals that a 20% interest rate on a $10,000 loan for 10 years costs you about 62,000 big ones. $10,000, it really cost you 62. Compare that to Bill Gates, who can spend $10,000 on a cheap card costing 3% and doesn't pay it back for 10 years. Well, here's the difference. The cost of renting that $10,000 for 10 years at 3%, well, it's about 1.35. And yes, Bill's cost of renting that dough for 10 years, well, 13.5 grand. Vastly cheaper because, well, Bill is a vastly safer bet to pay back his debts than you are. As for that 20% rate on your new credit card, well, it sounds steep, but it's sadly pretty average. Just be sure to pay it off each month, because if you get way behind in your payments, well, the magic wizard behind the curtain isn't going to swoop in to save you. Sorry, just keeping it real.